Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, it's me Gamerturk, and this is how I wish Sword Art Online progressive anime would begin, considering the actual beginning of Aincrad is not covered in progressive, as well as the fact that Aria of a Starless Night, the Floor 1 story, was already kinda adapted in the original anime, albeit heavily cut, losing two of its main narratives, only leaving a bare bones boss fight in the end with people thinking Diabel was a good guy of some sort. This will be something different than the usual Sword Art Online explained video I make. For starters, this is the first time I'm doing something like this, pitching a script in a sense, giving the story itself. But hey, SAO Wikia people enjoyed my scripting choices when I shared them throughout War of Underworld, so why not just share them for everyone here on my channel? I will keep the spoilers at a minimum and just pitch the opening to progressive here. However, I will be hinting at the two core narratives of Aria of a Starless Night in this video. So if you're a spoiler sensitive person and want to go into progressive series completely blind, I do recommend you do not watch this video. You can come after progressive actually airs and compare my intro idea to what the anime adaptation ended up doing and share your opinions after that in a year or two. Also, another rather obvious disclaimer, I'm just a guy who's considered by those around him to have a good intuition for design stuff. That's an actual quote I heard way too many times in my life. I'm not an animator, I'm not a storyboarder, I technically have zero experience, and all I got as credentials is being touted as someone who knows how to present things in an impactful manner. But yeah, without further ado, here's how I would want Sword Art Online Progressive to kick off, whether it's a movie or a weekly anime. First off, setting some goals is important in my opinion. The goal is to optimize the introduction sequence for three completely separate groups of audiences who will watch the series. I do strongly believe this is a key decision to be made. Unlike the main series anime that caters to two audiences, progressive anime will be catering to three different audiences. First two are the same as the main series anime. Those are the light novel readers who have extensive knowledge of the events, and secondly, the regular anime audience who do have some backstory information from the original Aincrad anime going into progressive anime. The third group is the newcomers, which I believe the progressive will be heavily marketed towards as well, and will be the new entry point to the series in a sense. The problem is that it puts the third group especially in a weird spot, as they require fundamental information of what is happening, since progressive kicks off 3 weeks into the Sword Art Online prison. So the basics of what Sword Art Online is still need to be conveyed to a certain extent by the progressive anime. However, now that comes at odds for the regular anime audience who already have the background information. Retelling all this stuff will give them the idea that progressive is somewhat of a reboot, which it isn't. So for that audience, the intro also needs to make it clear that what they're about to watch is basically the continuation of what they have watched in episode 1 of the Aincrad anime. Meanwhile, light novel readers are always the neglected bunch here. My intro will aim to alleviate this with very simple additions to the intro sequence. To summarize, the key goals are to: Number 1, give the newcomers sufficient information as an entry point. Number 2, give regular anime audience an introduction that clarifies what progressive is and isn't. And 3, give the light novel readers the bare minimum attention at the very least. As such, my ideal introduction to the progressive anime starts with a short 3 to 4 minute section from Kirito's perspective before the opening sequence kicks in the case of a weekly anime, or the movie logo kicks in the case of a movie. We open up basically the same way as the original anime. We start with Sugu leaving home, Kirito checking magazines and diving in, coming across Klein, teaching him how to play, Kayaba's announcement, and Kirito leaving Klein behind. Well, that was 20 minutes of content in the original anime, obviously, not 3 to 4 minutes of content. The key thing is, we are going for an optimized version taking all three audiences into consideration. We do not need to have this extensive sequence specifically with Kirito. That's very much redundant for anime viewers and light novel readers, whereas it is too much info to cram into 3 to 4 minutes for the newbies. So the plan is, these 4 minutes solely exist to establish the tone, not to give an extensive background information. 20 minutes of footage can roll in the background as a very condensed version of it, as Kirito narrates the situation, something along the lines of like this. Sword Art Online, the next step in home entertainment, the first game taking advantage of all human senses in a VR environment, utilizing the full dive technology to its full extent, built by the genius Kawahara Reki. Despite being a virtual world, I always felt more alive in the floating castle named Aincrad than I ever did in the real world. Spending a couple of hours with a newbie to teach him the ropes, Klein and I were suddenly teleported to the town of beginnings along with the remaining 10,000 players. At that point, we learned one simple truth. Sword Art Online might be a game, but it's not something you play. The announcement from the creator of the game, Kawahara Reki, let the players know that Aincrad was now their only reality. Players who die in the game would die in the real world too. As if for one last joke, Kawahara Reki turned the avatars of each and every player into their real-life appearances utilizing the high-detail scan feature of the nerve gear and concluded what he called a tutorial for what was now a death game. No, not a game, but our new reality that we would not be able to escape until clearing all 100 floors of the floating castle, Aincrad. The real Sword Art Online had just begun at that very moment. Fearing the responsibility of taking care of multiple people and inevitably leading to their deaths, I abandoned my first and only friend, Klein, at the town of beginnings. His understanding attitude was relieving, but it only made me feel worse about abandoning him then and there, an act I would regret for years to come. What followed right after was a dark blur I always wanted to forget. I set out to the next town, Horunka, to get a head start to efficiently grind using my experience from the beta test. The same day, I was almost killed by another beta tester by the name of Copper, someone whom I decided to trust, someone who tried to monster player kill me to obtain the prized anneal blade I was aiming for. He paid dearly for his ambitions and was the first real death I experienced in SAO. As he reached out to me for a last cry for help, I did nothing but watch him get overwhelmed and hear that eerie sound of polygons shattering for the first time for a real human. 3 weeks flew by as beta testers distinguished themselves from the rest using their prior knowledge. I had no hope of ever clearing this game and going back to the real world. I was a solo player, only taking care of myself to ensure my survival as long as possible. But everything changed, my entire perspective shattered on that one day inside the Floor 1 labyrinth. There she was, a solo female rapier player, graciously, elegantly, perfectly executing the basic skill, linear back to back. I saw her. On that day, everything changed. Everything had just begun. And with Asuna collapsing on the ground, we get the opening sequence or the movie logo respectively. As you can see, that is a very brief intro that provides newcomers all they need to know, makes it very clear that we are continuing where the first episode of the original series left off for the anime people, and gives a nice reference for the light novel readers by incorporating the first day side story featuring Copper. We get a massive insight into Kirito's outlook, his regrets, his hopes, establishing the tone of the death game, and introduces us to the main character of my pitch, Asuna herself at the very end, who will be the catalyst to provide all the in-depth fundamental information about the death game to the newcomer audience in a bit as we switch to our perspective after the logo/opening sequence. You see, Asuna is not the main character of the progressive series. Well, you can consider her and Kirito to be co-main characters. Kirito still has much more weight that Asuna is basically a deuteragonist, much like Yuji in Alicization, but despite that fact, in my pitch, I put Asuna front and center for the first floor story. There are two main reasons for doing this. One, well, technically speaking, Aria of a Starless Night was already adapted as I mentioned at the beginning of this video. It was a story written by Reki Kawahara with a request from the anime staff for the original series so that they would have something happening early on in Aincrad. However, the story he wrote was completely butchered to fit into a single episode, and what remained was only the boss fight in episode 2 against Ilfang the Cobalt Lord, and that was adapted completely from Kirito's perspective. So by giving Asuna the spotlight here, the entire story, even the bits that were adapted, will feel somewhat fresh for those who already watched the original series. Second and more important reason, it's the perfect introduction for newcomers. That is why I feel a short overview is more than enough at the beginning from Kirito's perspective, and then as we switch over to Asuna, we experience the death game all over from her perspective, allowing us to retread the information in a more in-depth manner. Remember, Kirito is pretty much experienced at this point, having grinded 3 weeks in a familiar environment and has come to terms with what Sword Art Online is, and that is the beginning of progressive. He has lived through his shock back in the first day, so he's not particularly a good subject to follow for the experience of the death game, the initial shock I mean, whereas Asuna is still very much in that shock. That's why she was in the dungeon, that's why she was using basic equipment, and that's why she collapsed completely unconscious right then and there. And for the beginning of Sword Art Online Progressive, it will be Asuna's story that we'll experience in my pitch. After the logo fades out, we rewind a little 3 weeks with some anime original content. Mind you, the only reason I call this anime original content is because we actually learn these things as flashbacks here and there rather than read as a single event. There, we see what the teaser showed us, Asuna seeing Sword Art Online everywhere, getting curious, and when she gets home, she wants to see what the fuss is all about and logging in using the nerve gear of her brother, who had to take an urgent business trip. And there, we see Asuna cheerfully exploring a bit until she is force teleported into the town of beginnings, and then that's the point where we properly experience the Kayaba Akiko speech. Not from Kirito's perspective, who is accurately piecing all the information together to have a solid game plan, but from Asuna's perspective, who is losing strength in her knees with every sentence Kayaba spouts, not being able to make sense of any of the things, acting in complete shock and denial. Thus, the newcomers are introduced to the full extent of what SAO is, with the horror newbie Asuna is experiencing, rather than the confident plans and course of actions of the MMORPG veteran Kirito, as Asuna takes refuge in an inn at the town of beginnings for 3 weeks, doing nothing but crying uncontrollably and thinking about everything that got thrown out of the window in her perfect real life. And there, we get a second set of narration, this time from Asuna, talking about how she was sick of sulking, how she would not lose herself to the game, and about her solution, a narration like the one follows. Even I had no explanation as to why on the afternoon of November 6, 2022, I'd slipped into my brother's vacant room, put the already prepared nerve gear on, and spoke the link start command. The only thing I knew was that everything had changed that day. Everything had ended. I locked myself inside an inn room in the town of beginnings, waiting for the ordeal to be over, but not a single message had made its way through from the real world in over 2 weeks. I gave up hoping for a rescue from the outside. And with over 1,000 players already dead and the first dungeon of the game still unbeaten, I understood that defeating the game from the inside was equally impossible. The only choice left was in how to die. The third week, I left the city rather than curling up in the dark, living in fear of the future. I ran, thrust, vanish. At least this way, I would not be mourning my lost future and choose how I die myself. And I had chosen it. Friday, December 2nd, 2022, inside a labyrinth that I knew nothing about, I felt the time had come. The name Asuna carved inside the Black Iron Palace would be struck and everything would come to a close. As I collapsed unconscious, I saw him running towards me. And those two intros from two different perspectives coming together at that point in time, with Asuna's side being lengthier of course to give some more backstory, should perfectly establish a massive and solid groundwork to build upon. It illustrates clearly what Sword Art Online is for the newcomers, as well as painting it very clearly for the anime audience that Progressive is not there to reboot, but rather tell the untold portions of the Aincrad story. From that point onwards, it won't even matter all that much who is particularly the main character on screen, although it's better if we switch to Kirito for the majority of the time due to the ongoing Anil Blade narrative, but regardless, at that point, both Kirito and Asuna are basically together. Whoever ends up being the quote-unquote main character on paper doesn't make much difference on the practical side of things. However it's adapted, we should still get Asuna's perspective change over the course of Floor 1, as well as the Anil Blade narrative, followed by the first boss fight, which of course is technically an already adapted portion of the story, but pretty much all the contradictions you'll see here is because the original anime did not adapt this story correctly in the first place. But yeah, that has been my pitch for how the beginning of Sword Art Online Progressive adaptation should go, in my opinion. Once we reach that middle ground point between the two characters, I didn't want to go any further. For one, because at the time of the making of this video, we still do not know if it will be a movie or a weekly series, and my approach would of course change depending on the format, because well, 20-minute breaks are different than an entire 120 minutes of flowing narrative. And also, I did not want to go into further content to ensure we don't get to more spoilery points of the story, but if you enjoyed this video and want to hear me pitch future content with a structure, do let me know. I mean, I'll still wait until we learn if it's certainly gonna be a movie or not. We expect more news on it on November 8th at the After War panel, but once we get that information fixed, I can certainly do more of these if it's something that'll interest you. If you enjoyed this, please do leave a like, of course. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more in-depth coverage of SAO. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter for the fastest news possible. 50k subscriber merch is live, as usual, drawn by the amazing Jen K. A huge thanks to all my patrons and channel members as always, and until next time, stay cool.